Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Knew Bakugo's Promise to Inko? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. It starts like this. Izuku came to slowly. His head was pounding. When he tried to lift his hand to cradle the aching space, he felt something heavy drag along with it. When he finally managed to blink his dry, burning eyes open, a shock of cold rushed through him. He had no idea where he was. It was some sort of dark, musty room. Like a prison cell from an old war movie. One wall to the right of him was almost entirely comprised of thick, metal bars, crisscrossed over each other so as to ensure no person could slip through. To the side of that was a thick metal door, seemingly padlocked shut. Sadly, he couldn't get any sort of idea as to where he was from the view out of the bars, as the only thing on the other side of them was a barren, stone hallway leading round a corner and out of sight. There weren't even any lamps or lights on in the room he was in, the only light source coming from the electric bulbs screwed in at neat intervals in the ceiling on the other side of the bars. Looking down at himself, Izuku realized he was still wearing the old, slightly ripped remains of his hero costume, lacking the helmet and gloves. Around his left wrist was a thick metal shackle, attaching him to a rung on the wall behind him with a length of sturdy-looking chain. And opposite him, restrained with an identical shackle, against a different wall, was Katsuki. Izuku essayed in a breath. Kaken? He didn't respond, still against the floor. He didn't look that injured, thankfully, though he was still unconscious, slumped against the floor. Izuku noted with worry that there seemed to be a small smudge of blood dripping from his hairline, as if he'd been hit in the head. His face looked almost peaceful, slumped against the cool stone floor, unknowing of the dilemma he would find himself in once he woke up. Izuku sighed. Katsuki would be so angry when he finally woke up. He hated being restrained, appearing weak, even if he would probably manage to find a way to escape fairly quickly. Izuku knew it would be made worse by his own presence. Katsuki hated him, and hated being around him. If there was one thing that would make a kidnapping even worse than it already was for Katsuki, it would be looking across to see that Midoriya Izuku was joining him. It was odd to think, but Katsuki's face was almost comforting to look at while he was asleep. Maybe that made Izuku sound a tad creepy. But he didn't mean it like that. It's not like he'd ever even seen Katsuki asleep before now, not really. It was just that. When he was asleep his face was relaxed. It wasn't tinged with the constant annoyance or hatred that he showed clearly every time Izuku interacted with him. It reminded Izuku of when they were younger, really young, before Izuku found out he was quirkless and everything went wrong in his life. Back to the time when they were just little kids, and Katsuki seemed to not mind, to even sometimes enjoy spending time around him, and they would play together without thinking of the possibility that the friendship would be cut off so very soon. The F, are you staring at shitty nerd? He jolted out of his thoughts at Katsuki's voice, rough from sleep. I wasn't, I just woke up dash, Izuku stuttered wildly as the blonde across from him slowly woke up, dragging himself up from the floor before finally realizing where they were and snapping his head about wildly. The F dash? What the f happened? Izuku opened his mouth to respond before hesitating, taking the time to think while Katsuki examined his bindings, tugging on his chain in agitation. What had happened? The last thing he remembered was waking up in the dorms on a Saturday and making plans with some others in their class to study together that evening. Try as he might, Izuku couldn't remember anything after that, and he doesn't remember deciding to do any physical training that day either. So how did he and Katsuki end up locked away together, wearing their hero costumes of all things? Katsuki was missing his wrist grenades, and the rest of his outfit was dirty, torn slightly in places, which he grimaced down at in disgust. I don't remember anything after Saturday morning. Do you? Izuku asked, hopeful that at last one of them would be able to provide some answers. Katsuki sneered at him, rolling his neck to stretch it out. No, fuckers must have drugged us or something. Have you just been sat there the entire time? A dash, Izuku faltered. I only just dash. So effing useless, Katsuki bit out, and Izuku flinched slightly out of habit. Dumbass gets kidnapped and doesn't even attempt to escape, typical. He muttered to himself, before nodding over at Izuku with nothing but contempt. I told you that quirk wouldn't change anything. You're still as helpless as ever, can't even get out of a single chain. He announced. Izuku set his jaw, a faint wave of irritation rushing through. He held back from pointing out that Katsuki only woke up a few moments after him and he hadn't escaped yet either, deciding that antagonizing the blonde probably wouldn't be helpful in this situation. Instead, he looked at the shackle on his wrist, gripping the base of the chain attached to the wall and focusing on activating one for all just enough so that he could tug himself free, Katsuki presumably doing the same to his own restraints with a well-placed explosion. He refused to be some damsel in distress, proving Katsuki right in his uselessness by having to wait to be saved instead of pulling his own weight. Except, where he would usually feel the comforting and adrenalizing thrum of power starting up in his veins, he felt nothing. Pulling at the thick chain did nothing, even when he gripped hard enough that he was sure the metal would begin to indent itself into his palms. He didn't hear anything either. No explosion or triumphant laugh from across the cell as Katsuki got himself free, leading to a cold sense of dread to rise through Izuku as he turned to look at him. Is your quirk working? It will. Katsuki snapped defensively, even as it was clear there would be no sparks emerging from his hands anytime soon. Izuku swallowed. Mine won't either, I think something's blocking our quirks. We don't have a way out. Katsuki punched the wall next to the metal rung out of frustration, turning back and slumping so he was sat leant against the wall, glaring at Izuku stubbornly. Obviously, fuckhead. That doesn't mean we gotta just sit and fucking wait to be rescued, though. If I'm doing that sheet again, I'll get us out without a quirk. Izuku sighed. Slightly. He couldn't see anything in the cell apart from himself and Katsuki, let alone something that could help them escape. There were no windows, or signs that anybody would come to visit them anytime soon, captor or rescuer. They were stuck in an unknown location with no food or water, no memory as to how they got there, and no resources to get away. Judging from the length of the chains he and Katsuki were attached to, crossed with the length of the room, they would barely even be within reach of each other if they got up and pulled away as far as they could, and neither of them would be able to reach the locked door. It was closer to Katsuki's side of the room, and he wouldn't be able to reach, so Izuku had no chance. All they could do was wait, and hope that something would happen soon. They'd been sitting in silence for about 20 minutes before they finally heard the sound of life echoing down the hall towards them. Izuku wasn't going to complain about the lack of conversation. When it came to Katsuki, silence was fine. Any interaction that didn't end up completely filled with insults and threats was a miracle, in his opinion. It was a little odd that somebody as usually loud and confident as Katsuki had opted for sitting in grumpy silence while they waited for some sort of opportunity to occur, but Izuku figured that having his quirk taken away and being forced to just sit and wait for somebody else to come and help them had probably bruised his ego a tad, and especially being as his only company was Izuku, so he probably didn't want to discuss it that much. The first time they got to see actual evidence of other people in wherever it was they were, was when they heard the purposeful, striding clomps of somebody walking down the hall towards their cell. Izuku immediately straightened his back from where he was sitting, and Katsuki jumped up, snarling in the direction of the bars even as his chain made a pathetic clinking sound at the motion. Soon, a man came into view, grinning at them in glee from the other side of their prison wall. He looked to be around his 30s, with slightly thinning brown hair and a pair of square glasses sat loosely on the bridge of his nose, which he pushed up with his index finger as he peered at them through the bars. He didn't seem very villainy by Izuku's standards. There was no dramatic villain outfit, or instant evil laugh followed by a heartfelt speech about how all heroes were wrong and he was finally going to show the world that he was a real threat. He just stood there, hands behind his back, wearing a comfortable-looking pair of jeans and a light gray sweater, a thin, long white coat thrown casually on top and left unbuttoned at the front. He didn't say anything, leaving Katsuki, like usual, to start yelling first. "And who are you? The F. Do you want with us?" "Huh?" The man didn't seem perturbed by Katsuki's rage, simply glancing over to him with calm interest. "Well, To be completely honest, I only wanted one of you. But the extraction went a little differently than I originally planned, so here you are. That's okay though, we can still have some fun with the both of you. Izuku blinked. What did he mean by that? He had only wanted one of them? Was he only supposed to grab Katsuki, or was it Izuku he wanted? He was looking at Katsuki when he said it. Did that imply that Katsuki was the one that wasn't planned? He wished he could remember what had happened before they got captured, that way he might be able to make sense of what he was saying. The hell's that supposed to mean? Katsuki took a step towards the man, only making it halfway before the chain became taut, forcing him to stop in his tracks. He jolted in anger. Let me out of these goddamn chains so I can kill you. Kaken, Izuku hissed warningly, maybe you shouldn't be provoking him. Especially when their quirks weren't working and they didn't even know why. Shut the Stay out of this. The man hummed, rolling his shoulders back as he commanded both of their attentions. A fascinating development in your relationship, especially after what I witnessed of your capture. Katsuki snarled as the man reached into one of the deep pockets adorning his coat, bringing out a big, silver key. He walked over to the door and inserted it into the padlock, smoothly opening it with a click, before returning the key to his pocket. You can call me the surgeon, I am the one that requested your presence here. He spoke as he opened the door, stepping into their cell with a relaxed aura, not seeming the least bit intimidated by Katsuki's vicious glares and threats. Still, Izuku couldn't help but notice how although he stepped into the cell with them, he took care to stay out of reach of them both, no doubt relying on the shortness of the chains to keep him safe. I know you must be wondering where your interesting little quirks have gone, and you don't have to worry. They were only taken temporarily, the effects will fade with time and they will come back. In fact, he rolled up one of his sleeves, revealing a sleek black watch nestled there. They should be returning in about 15 minutes. Of course, we can't be having that right now, so I'll just have to extend the effects. Izuku stiffened when the surgeon reached into his other pocket, his hand retreating to reveal 2 syringes sitting in his palm, both filled to the brim with an unknown, rusty-looking fluid. Like am I gonna let you stick me with that? Come at me, see what happens, Katsuki warned, eyeing up the needles with displeasure. The surgeon's lips thinned, and he reached behind his back to retrieve some sort of metal gun, its design unlike any Izuku had seen before. I'm well aware of your capabilities, Bakugo. I'm not unwise enough to engage you without precautions in place, he said, loading one of the syringes into the barrel of the gun, checking it was loaded correctly before turning and pointing it at Izuku. Shtick. Izuku couldn't help but cry out slightly, not having expected to be the first victim of whatever drag was being inflicted onto them. The needle was shot at him abruptly, tearing through the worn fabric of his costume and embedding itself into the unprotected skin of his collarbone, sticking there stubbornly. A single bead of blood bubbled around the edges, dripping down and soaking into the neck of his costume. The needle was thick and long, and it was impossible not to feel pain as it sunk into his flesh, the liquid inside the syringe disappearing as it was transferred into his bloodstream. Katsuki's head snapped towards him, eyes narrowing at the injury as Izuku quickly reached up to snatch the offending object out of his skin, letting the now empty syringe fall to the floor uselessly. It rolled away, coming to rest near the surgeon's feet, and he bent down to pick it up. See? Precautions. He commented simply, loading the second syringe into the gun and unceremoniously shooting Katsuki with it, sticking him in the leg. Shtick. The blonde refused to make a sound, wincing angrily and ripping it from his skin immediately. It was too late though, the needle did its job quickly, the liquid already gone from the clear barrel and no doubt making its way through his bloodstream. He kept a hold of the needle anyway, pointing the sharp end at their captor in a silent threat. Izuku grimaced, regretting letting his own potential weapon roll away without a second thought. Just because I don't have a working quirk doesn't mean I can't beat your butt, you old Katsuki spat. Oh, I don't doubt it, the surgeon easily agreed, causing Katsuki to falter slightly. But I'm afraid you won't get a chance to. I have other precautions, so don't worry about all that. Before Izuku could try to figure out what that meant, the surgeon was bringing out another set of syringes, this time filled with an almost clear, murky gray sort of color. These concoctions are of my own design, he explained, even as he loaded the first one into the gun. Of course, paralysis agents aren't uncommon. I could have just used one of those, but I've always found a certain sense of pride in using products of my own work. This specific variant works extra well because it doesn't completely paralyze its victim. Instead, it partially freezes your ability to use certain muscles while leaving your organs completely functional. Not only that, but it partially degrades eyesight temporarily and clouds your mind just enough to leave you unable to think clearly. To be less scientific about it, if you were injected with it, you would be left as a puppet with its strings cut, unable to move, or to see or think clearly where you would even be moving to. And yet, you would still be completely aware of everything going on around you. No memory issues, loss of consciousness, of any other deprivation of the senses. I'm quite proud of it, really. Yeah, whatever, you mix some FING chemicals, good for you. What's that got to do with us? What do you want? Katsuki snapped, unwilling to appease the rambling man and cutting off his self-promotion mercilessly. My apologies, I do tend to get quite carried away when talking about my experiments. For some reason, regardless of his calm and polite demeanor, Izuku couldn't help but be put off by this guy. There was something about the subtle self-assuredness he carried, how despite his quick acknowledgement that up against them he would be useless in a fight, he still had no qualms with acting like he had complete control over them. It was unsettling how impassive he was. Now, obviously since I had originally only expected for one of you to be here, I've had to adjust my plans slightly. But since we don't have any time limits on your stay here, I think I've come up with a fun way to pass the time, as well as provide myself with some valuable research. The surgeon smiled at them both, and Izuku stood up warily, standing in line with Katsuki as they both waited to find out what was going to come next. Unfortunately, due to some unforeseen circumstances, I find myself without any subjects for my research. I am a surgeon, yes, but I am also a scientist. Luckily, you two seem to have dropped into my lap right at the perfect time. I'm not a monster. I'm aware these scientific exhibitions will not be pleasant for the subject, and so as a compromise I'm willing to give you a small sense of control over the situation. The surgeon turned to Katsuki, a considerate look on his face. Bakugo, am I right in thinking that out of the two of you, you would consider yourself the one with the most authority? Katsuki glared at him, nodding his head towards Izuku mockingly. What, you think it's this fucking nerd? The surgeon turned to Izuku. Would you agree, Midoriya? Izuku hesitated, glancing towards his childhood friend-turned-bully. Katsuki was definitely the one that called the shots, whether Izuku wanted him to or not. Although, Katsuki's version of authority towards Izuku was more of an unbridled hatred towards him, knowing that he was better and therefore able to crush Izuku in any way possible. Izuku had accepted a long time ago that any friendship between himself and Katsuki was dead. Now his main goal when interacting with the blonde was just to avoid his wrath. They would get out of this, Izuku knew they would. If Aizawa and the rest of UA didn't get there first, then Katsuki would find a way out. All Izuku needed to do was stay out of his way so as to not anger him or ruin his ideas. That was how they worked best together after all. I guess. The surgeon smiled at him, nodding. I see. Well then, I guess the control will go to Bakugo. He turned back to the blonde, holding the loaded syringe gun loosely in one hand and moving to hold both his arms behind his back. You get to choose. You or him. It took a few seconds before Katsuki responded. Heh. The surgeon tilted his head, bemused. I'm telling you I need a subject. Somebody for me to use in my research and for my experiments. You, Bakugo, get to choose who it will be. Shall I take you for the first session? Or your classmate? Izuku's jaw dropped. To be experimented on? For research? What did that even mean? It didn't take a genius to figure it out. From the surgeon's own comments, to the drags he had brought with him as precautions, to the morbidly apathetic way he spoke about the teenagers he had kidnapped and shackled to walls. Whatever his research entailed, it wouldn't be in any way pleasant. One of them had to go. Wouldn't it be better if it was Izuku? Katsuki needed time without distractions like him so he could find a way out of here for them. If Izuku could keep the surgeon distracted with his research, Then maybe they would get out of this quicker. Not to mention, out of the two of them, Izuku was probably more desensitized to being hurt. Katsuki wouldn't have an issue in choosing Izuku. He never did. Izuku turned to him, giving an almost imperceptible nod. Go ahead. Katsuki had an unreadable look on his face as he turned to level his head at their captor, jaw set. Me. Whatever effed up stuff you're gonna do, you do it to me. What? The surgeon ignored Izuku's outburst, as did Katsuki, refusing to even meet his eyes. A wonderful choice. To be honest, I was hoping that this was what you would choose. Kaken dash. Great. So what happens now, huh? Katsuki pushed on, cutting off Izuku without a second glance. In response, the surgeon smiled a toothy grin, holding up the syringe gun and leveling it at Katsuki's chest. Well, like I said, I'm not stupid enough to collect my subjects without extra precautions. Shtick. Katsuki didn't even get time to attempt a dodge, the needle embedding itself directly in the center of his chest. Again, he quickly ripped it out, brandishing a needle in each hand and trying to look threatening even as his legs started to falter. Kaken! Izuku gasped, instinctively stepping towards the blonde only for the chain to hold him back only a few steps away. F off, dipshit, I'm fine. He seemed to be convincing himself more than Izuku, having to take a quick step back when one of his knees buckled. It works quickly, doesn't it? The surgeon remarked, pride tinting his tone as he casually waited for his prey to be incapacitated. One of the needles fell out of Katsuki's grip, the other one being surrendered soon after as he started to blink rapidly, holding one arm out to the wall so he could support himself. Fucking, I'll kill you, he muttered, before his legs finally gave out and he crashed to the hard ground, barely keeping his head upright. Kaken dash. Helpless, Izuku could do nothing but yell as his childhood bully seemed to deteriorate until he was slumped over completely, breathing heavily and unable to move at all. What did you do? He demanded, whirling round to stare down the surgeon and tugging on his chain as he tried to step forward. The surgeon blinked, as if confused. I already told you? He'll be returned here after the session, you don't have to worry about that. Food and water will be delivered to you as and when you need it, and I will have an intern take you for a bathroom break at some point. As he spoke, he pushed his glasses back on his nose, checking his watch before striding over to Katsuki's defenseless form. Wait, stay away from him. The surgeon ignored him, taking another key from his pocket and unlocking the shackle around Katsuki's limp wrist, shoving him around until he was in the right position to be picked up, one arm supporting his shoulders and the other under his knees. Katsuki's head rolled against the man's chest, eyes unfocused as they stared at the ceiling. It seemed so wrong for somebody as powerful as Katsuki to be so helpless. He'd chosen that in place of Izuku? What are you going to do to him? He asked, anger useless in his veins without his quirk to back it up. The surgeon ignored him, turning and starting back towards the exit of the cell. Don't ignore me. Where are you taking him? Izuku yelled, pulling on his chains desperately, wishing he could follow so he could get Katsuki out of that strange man's arms. Would you be quiet? He finally snapped. Izuku went still at the sudden anger in the previously polite man's voice. Another set of footsteps started approaching down the hall, accompanied by a sound that reminded him of a shopping cart rattling against the rough tarmac of the uneven roads near his childhood home. The surgeon sighed as another figure appeared just outside the cell, pushing along what looked like an old rickety medical bed, like somebody had been trying to recreate a hospital but had run out of funding. This figure was slightly shorter than him, wearing a standard laboratory getup that looked straight out of a video game. What threw Izuku off was the plague doctor mask the figure was wearing, completely obscuring their face and succeeding in being slightly intimidating, the sharp-pointed beak staring him down creepily, large silver buckles glinting under the fluorescent light. Katsuki was dumped abruptly onto the flat surface of the bed by the surgeon, the figure arranging his limbs so he was laying straight, hazy eyes staring upwards and limbs not moving. The surgeon allowed the figure to take custody of his new subject, instead stepping back into the cell for a moment, and to Izuku's horror, bringing back out the syringe gun. You said only one of us. Oh, I'm not taking you, I just want to ensure you stay quiet for a while. The surgeon replied simply. The yelling was getting on my nerves. He turned to the figure outside the cell, not pausing as his fingers deftly loaded the second syringe into the gun, gray liquid swirling menacingly. In turn, take the research assistant to my personal operating theater. The apparent intern nodded once, turning the bed around in the small hall and pushing it away without a word. Izuku didn't get the chance to object, as he was the last victim of that horrid gun, feeling a sudden sharp pain in his right thigh as another grotesquely large needle sliced directly into his skin, injecting him with a dose of whatever concoction had just been used on Katsuki. Shtick. He could feel the effects almost immediately. His eyes started to feel slightly unfocused, as if he'd just been spun around a bunch of times and then asked to walk in a straight line. His arms and legs began to feel heavier and heavier, unable to hold him up anymore. He fell against the wall behind him with a hard smack, sliding down it slowly as he desperately tried to keep control of his own body. He couldn't. It fell away before his mind even connected that he was losing it. He was still fully awake, fully conscious. He was forced to stay in his position, slumped sideways on the floor with his arms splayed out on the ground in front of him, the shackle tugging in an uncomfortable way but unable to adjust it. The way his eyes kept fuzzing over made him feel nauseous, but he couldn't even close them. It took too much effort to keep them shut, he could barely manage the effort to blink. He could hear and feel everything around him, completely aware of the way the surgeon waltzed over to pick up the rest of his used syringes, before stepping out of the cell and locking it again with his key. Izuku couldn't help but feel like it was a useless practice, what with the state he was in currently. He wondered how long until the drag wore off. He wondered how long until he got his quirk back. Thank you for your cooperation, Midoriya. The surgeon said, back to his deceptively polite ways. Izuku wanted to scream at him, to tear off his chains and break through those bars so he could go and save Katsuki from whatever it was that was about to happen. But he couldn't. He just had to lie there. And wait. It was horrible. It got worse when Katsuki's screams started to echo through the halls. It starts like this. Izuku stays there, laying on the ground, listening to his childhood bully scream in pain. He doesn't know where Katsuki is, or what exactly is happening to him, but he knows it's bad. The screams are torturous. They started out small, like he'd been refusing to make noise, and it was only these little yelps that were finally fighting their way out of his mouth, having reached his limit. Then they got worse. Katsuki seemed to give up on saving face, letting himself scream until his voice was hoarse and throat cracked, all amplified by the way it echoed down the long stone hall, only just making its way to Izuku's cell. Katsuki hated showing weakness. He despised giving villains, or anybody, the satisfaction of it. That told Izuku that if he was screaming in such a way like this, raw pain spilling out of his mouth in such a regular fashion, then whatever was being done to him must be worse than Izuku could ever imagine. And yet, Katsuki still never screamed out for anyone. He didn't yell for help, or plead, or beg. He screamed, but he didn't try to stop it. Not audibly at least. Despite the paralyzing agent running through his body, Izuku swore he could feel the terrified, cold body shudders that traveled up his spine every time he heard another of those blood-curdling screams, coming from the one person that he thought would never be brought that low. That's what made it so hard for Izuku to listen to. Because Katsuki had chosen this. In place of him. He didn't even like Izuku. How was it fair that he was taking the pain instead? If Izuku had maybe fought for more control, or argued with Katsuki more, maybe he could have been taken instead. Then he wouldn't have to lie here, unable to move an inch, tears slowly slipping out of his blurry eyes as he was forced to listen to every single thing happening to Katsuki. Another scream, unfiltered and desperate, rushed through the bars and into his ears, like a wave of water thundering down a tunnel and crashing directly into Izuku's skull. How long would this last? He had no way of tracking the time in the dingy cell he was trapped in. His only way of guessing that a substantial amount had gone by was when he slowly started to regain the feelings in his limbs, his eyes becoming clear again. It didn't make a difference. He still couldn't leave. All he could do was sit up so he was leaning against the wall, and give one more pathetic tug to the chain holding him back. Still no quirk. The worst bit was when the screaming went silent. That was when Izuku had to fight with himself, torn between feeling hopeful that the torture had finally stopped and the small, unwanted thoughts of what if it wasn't the torture that had stopped, but Katsuki? After a while, there was that familiar sound of the medical bed, rumbling down the hall towards him, and he perked up, the hopeful thoughts growing stronger. Until he saw the sight laying on top, and everything hopeful inside him crashed to the ground. The surgeon wasn't there, having apparently left his intern to deal with the cleanup. The masked person unlocked the cell door and picked Katsuki up off the table like a sack of flour, harshly letting him drop back onto the floor so he could lock the shackle back onto his wrist. Katsuki didn't even try to fight. How could he, in his condition? He must have been given another dose of the paralyzing drag, because he didn't even twitch throughout the entire experience. The masked intern locked the cell behind him and left without a word, the rickety noise of the medical bed being pushed away, the only noise in the otherwise silent room. Kaken. What did they do? Izuku scrambled forward on his hands and knees, desperate to offer some sort of comfort or help to the blonde, whether or not any past attempts at helping him would have gone down well. To his immense frustration, he found that the chain length kept them just out of reach of each other. If Katsuki had gone as far forward as his chain allowed, they might have been able to brush hands at least, but with the way Katsuki seemed, Izuku didn't think he'd be moving anytime soon. Katsuki's already beaten-up costume had been torn away in some places on his chest, leaving the top part barely covering him. Izuku could see gauze patches peeking through holes in the fabric, and there was a trail of dried blood stemming from his nose. His arms were almost completely swathed in thick white bandages, but that didn't comfort Izuku, because he could see the multiple places where bright red blood was still spilling out, vibrant splotches growing larger and larger on the medical wraps coating his limbs. Oh my god! Kaken! Izuku didn't know what to say. He could feel his eyes start to brim with empathetic tears, and he quickly tried to blink them away, knowing Katsuki would hate them. Katsuki already hated being vulnerable, but being vulnerable around Izuku? He didn't want to make this worse than it already was for the blonde. After all, Katsuki had only been taken away in place of him. Fu, CK off, I-hole. You're too close. Izuku jumped, falling back onto the palms of his hands, watching as Katsuki started to roughly and slowly move from where he had been lying limply on the ground. Kaken, I thought you'd been drugged. Katsuki winced, dragging his legs underneath him so he was sat cross-legged, leaning against the wall. He checked himself over for a moment, prodding at the bandages he'd been wrapped in before gingerly letting his arms rest on his knees, careful to not let anything touch his wrists. Fucking fine, he bit out, leaning his head back so he was staring up against the ceiling, firmly ignoring Izuku's concerned presence and closing his eyes. His voice sounded exhausted and hoarse from the screaming. It was no wonder he wanted to rest for a bit. Fucker made sure nothing he did was too bad, didn't want to kill off his stupid fucking research project, so you can stop with the pity eyes. He snapped. It didn't sound like it wasn't that bad, Izuku said without thinking, before immediately snapping his mouth shut, regretting his words. Katsuki's head whipped down to look at Izuku, and it was clear on his face that he hadn't thought his screams could be heard. Shut the F dash. He threatened, Izuku hurriedly nodding his head so as to not make things worse. There was silence in the cell for a few moments. Izuku trying not to make it too obvious that he was staring at Katsuki's injuries, and Katsuki returning to stare at the ceiling, ignoring the other boy. The surgeon. Izuku eventually started, quiet and timid. That won't happen again, yeah? We're gonna get out of here. The blood started to seep through the last layer of bandages on Katsuki's wrists, dripping down and getting absorbed by the fabric covering his knees below, filling the cell with a metallic scent. Fucking, obviously, shitty nerd. It starts like this. Katsuki is silent for a long time, only ever talking to interrupt Izuku when he tries to speak. After what Katsuki had done, the bullet that had been taken for him, he decided that he should let the silence Katsuki so clearly wanted to transpire happen. They both sat there for what felt like hours, Izuku quietly worrying for the health of his classmate but unable to ask after him. He didn't really have to either. It was clear that whatever had happened had taken a lot out of the blonde. He'd been so exhausted that the surgeon hadn't even bothered drugging him during the transfer back into the cell, clearly confident that Katsuki was in no shape to try and fight anybody. He was right to. After a while, emotional and physical exhaustion got to them both, sleep pulling at their eyes. They never spoke about it verbally, but there seemed to be a silent agreement that one of them should stay awake at all times. Katsuki was the first to pass out, although he tried his best not to. A short while later he jolted awake, hard eyes daring Izuku to mention the way he struggled to slump comfortably with his injuries. Then it was Izuku's turn to sleep, fitful, dreamless snatches that didn't help refresh him in any way. He gave up trying in the end, too worried that the surgeon would return with only the injured blonde to face him. Katsuki was obviously wanted alive, at least. That was shown by the medical attention he had received before being returned, however lax the effort was. Izuku had an inkling that it was on purpose, that the surgeon had helped out just enough to keep Katsuki in good health, but not enough to allow him to return to full strength, so he could keep him in check. It worked, since Katsuki barely moved from his place against the wall. He didn't even mock Izuku when he tried various methods of getting out of his chains, each attempt failing more pathetically than the last. He just sat there, glaring with contempt every time Izuku dared to make eye contact with him. Eventually, they were graced by another visit from the surgeon, although Izuku could tell from the intern bringing up the rear with that same medical bed that it wouldn't be a good visit. "How have you been healing, Bakugo?" was the first thing he said, staring at them through the bars as if he was just a doctor asking after one of his patients, and not some psychopathic monster who had been torturing Katsuki a short while ago. Izuku hated him. "F you." Katsuki responded, voice gravely and tired. Clearly, although it felt like they'd been trapped there for days, it wasn't long enough for his voice to have completely healed. "Perfect." The surgeon was unperturbed, clapping his hands together in satisfaction. "Because I need your next decision." "What decision?" Izuku demanded, his anxiety spiking. "I've given you around 10 hours to recalibrate, but I find myself bored and wanting to continue my research." Their captor angled himself towards Katsuki's side of the cell. "Bakugo, you're still the one in charge here, so I'll ask you. Will the next session be taken by you again? Or is it Midoriya's turn?" Izuku jolted upwards, shaking his head rapidly. "No. Wait, don't take him again, it's my turn, you have to take me." "It's not your decision to make, Midoriya, it's Bakugo's." Izuku sighed in relief, turning to Katsuki. "Tell him it's my turn, I want to go. You took it last time, this is only fair." He was happy at least that Katsuki was able to make a choice every time one of these apparent sessions would take place. That meant Izuku could take some of the brunt until they got out of there. Katsuki wasn't stupid, he knew it would be better for them to take turns at least, if not to just let Izuku take all of them. The first time, Katsuki had probably agreed to the torture himself because neither of them knew it was torture, and he might have wanted to get out the cell, to see if there would be a chance to attack. Obviously, that was before they knew about the drags, so that was a pointless venture now. Katsuki would be more useful if he stayed back and rested in the cell this time. Who knows, perhaps he could spot an opportunity for escape that Izuku didn't, back when he was too busy sobbing into the floor of their cell. Katsuki wouldn't have that problem. "Kaken? Tell them I'll go." He prompted again. Katsuki didn't seem to be completely comprehending his words, not even having turned to acknowledge Izuku, still staring at the surgeon with pure hatred swirling around his pupils. Finally, he glanced at Izuku, who nodded with an encouraging smile. He turned back to the bars blocking their exit. "I already told you." "Me." Izuku's face dropped. "What? Kaken, why would you dash?" "Wonderful. This means we can pick up right where we left off earlier." The surgeon wasted no time, this time not even bothering to open the cell door before getting out that putrid syringe gun, simply shoving the nozzle through the bars and expertly detaining Katsuki with a shot to the arm. "Kaken. Midoriya, do we really have to revisit this issue again? There will be interns coming to give you food and water soon. Do you really want to be unable to accept it when they arrive? Be quiet." The surgeon's voice was apathetic, bordering on bland as he unlocked the door, collecting Katsuki in the same fashion as before while Izuku could only watch on in horror, the echoes of last time whirling around his head. "I don't understand. Why not just let me dash?" He muttered to himself, lost. He wasn't given an answer, and there was nothing he could do to stop Katsuki from being taken away yet again. 2 more interns showed up an unidentifiable amount of time later, letting themselves into the cell and placing a bowl of oatmeal next to a cup of water, just within reach of Izuku's chain. Izuku himself barely even noticed, having been staring at the empty shackle on the other side of the cell blankly. The interns were unbothered by the painful cacophony drifting from somewhere else in the building. There were less screams this time, but Izuku didn't let that raise his spirit. He knew the most likely scenario was just that Katsuki's voice had given up quicker than it did the first time. He was forced to take notice of the food when one of the masked figures started shoveling the stuff into his face, forcing the spoon into his mouth and taking him by surprise. Again, anger started to flow through him. He used his free arm to swing out at the intern, almost appending the bowl and somehow managing to punch the beak part of the mask so hard that it cracked. In response, the other intern silently stepped forward and stomped on his shackled wrist, before kicking him in the stomach. He opened his mouth to yell out and was greeted with another spoonful of oatmeal. His eyes brimmed with tears as he allowed them to feed him. He was just one kid, quirkless and weak, against 2 fully grown adults with strength, freedom, and who knew what weapons at their disposal. He was helpless against them. They unlocked his shackle after he had eaten, taking him by an arm each and dragging him to a musty, tiny bathroom situated only a few feet down the hall from their cell. He tried to get a look around the area, but there didn't seem to be any helpful details. They shoved him inside the box-like room and slammed the door, locking him inside for 5 minutes with nothing but a rusty toilet, barely working sink, and the mold on the ceiling. When they unlocked the door and hauled him back to his prison, he was startled by the realization that during the time he'd been away, Katsuki had been returned. His bandages had been replaced, but the bags under his eyes had deepened significantly, and that, plus the addition of 2 twin streams of dried blood stemming from his ears, as well as the black eye and busted lip, did not give Izuku any comfort at all. Still, he seemed more aware than he had the first time, having already been stood up when the interns opened the cell door and quickly dragged Izuku back over to his shackle, locking him in securely. He almost looked worried. But that couldn't be right. Katsuki was the only person being tortured here. The F took so long they do anything? His voice barely worked, and Izuku winced at how painful it sounded. Shouldn't I be asking that to you? He muttered back, eyes lingering on his injuries pointedly. Why didn't you let them take me instead? Katsuki dropped back to the floor, fingers picking at the bloody wraps around his chest. None of your effing business, nerd. Izuku gaped at him. Kaken, they're torturing you. If you're letting yourself be taken because you think it will help us escape, you can at least tell me the plan. Katsuki gave him an odd look, before rolling his eyes, letting himself slump lower to the floor until he was basically laying on his side, head back so he could look at the ceiling, one of his hands applying pressure to a particularly tightly bandaged spot on his abdomen, which was only visible because his costume had been completely torn away at that spot. Just shut up, Deku. This sheet's tiring on its own, I don't need you whining on top of it. Izuku didn't know what to say. What was Katsuki doing? What was his plan? What was going on? Why was he doing this? If they come again and they ask who to take, he whispered, easily heard in the silent cell. Will you let them take me instead? Katsuki didn't answer for a few moments. No. Why? Izuku asked desperately. We have more chances of fighting back if we're both in an okay condition. You know, it makes more sense if you take some time to rest and I get taken next time. They're hurting you. He couldn't think of a single reason behind Katsuki's actions since they'd woken up here. It baffled him, the sudden illogical change in character. Katsuki had always been a good strategist. It was the one thing the two could usually come to minor agreements over. Why would he be throwing that all out the window? But they aren't hurting you. Katsuki muttered. So? What do you care? His chains rattled as he used his arm to gesture wildly. Since when have you ever cared about my well-being? You've tortured me my whole life. You don't dash. You can think whatever the F you want, Deku. I'm not letting you get hurt. Izuku stared at him, still poised mid-sentence as Katsuki snapped over to him. A sort of morbid calm washed over Izuku, indignance overruling the concern, and he straightened. But you've never held back before, he said, toneless. Katsuki didn't answer. He only shifted, turning over so he was facing the wall, his back to Izuku. They stew in that silence until the surgeon came again. It starts like this. They don't know how much time passes between what the surgeon calls his sessions, but every time he comes by, he gives Katsuki a choice. Him or Izuku. He always chooses himself. Izuku gives up trying to convince him to give himself a break after the 5th session. He notices the way Katsuki gets weaker and weaker every time he's returned to their cell, and he also knows how incredibly stubborn the blonde can be. He focuses instead on trying to make sure Katsuki can just stay alive until somebody comes to save them. He's never even seen him get given food or drink yet. He knows, logically, that they must have been in the cell for at least a few days, so Katsuki must be given some sort of sustenance during the time he spends away from the cell, otherwise he wouldn't be alive. Still, Izuku worries. He stopped fighting the interns whenever they gave him food and water, until they just start leaving the plastic bowl, spoon, and cup in the cell for him to eat by himself. They warned him, the first time they did it, that these gifts were only for him, and that Katsuki must not have any. Their voices sounded robotic and unnerving. Izuku had nodded quickly, wanting them to leave. Those masks creeped him out. He knew it was the same 2 interns that kept coming back to keep him alive, because one of them still had a large crack running up the side of their beak. When Katsuki was returned, Izuku waited a few minutes after they'd been left alone before getting as close to him as possible, the chain, as always, stopping just before he was close enough to touch. He didn't know how long they'd been there, but he didn't think they could keep this up for much longer. Katsuki wasn't doing well. The surgeon knew it too. He didn't even bother to drag Katsuki. Before carrying him away anymore, knowing he was too weak to be any sort of threat. Hey, Kaken, come on, you can rest later, you need to eat. He didn't know why he was whispering. It wasn't like they ever got any visitors during this time in their new schedule. Katsuki only grunted slightly, not moving from where he was laying a few feet away from Izuku. The top part of his costume had now been completely removed, allowing more evidence of the sessions to shine through. Some of the old bandages had been removed, allowing Izuku to see where something had clearly sliced into Katsuki's chest multiple times, angry red lines that were surprisingly neat and surgical, barely healed and agitated, with dried blood covering him in patches. There were burns on his hands, blistered and raw, to the point where Katsuki couldn't touch anything without causing himself pain. Occasionally he would return with bruises littering his face and neck, and there were weird-looking holes in his skin, like track marks but slightly bigger. Izuku had no idea what was really going on during those sessions, but he knew they were killing Katsuki and fast. The blonde didn't even scream when he was taken away anymore. It wasn't a comfort. Izuku still heard those screams every time he closed his eyes. Seeing his childhood friend turn bully like this still hurt Izuku, tears brimming every time he focused on the injuries adorning his body. Kaken, please, just drink something at least. The oatmeal and water he'd saved were nudged forward, using the very tips of his fingers until the lip of the cup just brushed the end of Katsuki's nose, water sloshing and threatening to spill. His eyes cracked open, seeming confused at the sight in front of him, before it dawned on him what Izuku was trying to do, and his eyes widened. He struggled to lift himself up, trying not to lean his hands on anything and positioning himself upright, turning his palms inward and using his knuckles to nudge the offerings back over to Izuku. No. Not allowed, stop it. Izuku's shoulders slumped, barely able to bear watching the pathetic way Katsuki was forced to move, struggling to stay up without the wall behind him as support. What are you talking about? Kaken, I'm not hungry, I'll get more later, you can have it. Katsuki shuffled forward, until his own chain was pulled taut, and they were close enough that Izuku knew that if he were to just reach out, he could at least hold Katsuki's hand, or his arm, or something. Just enough to prove that he was still alive, still okay. He doesn't. Katsuki wouldn't like that. They told me he's cut off with a cough, his voice like sandpaper. It's for you, I'm not allowed it. I know they told you to. Izuku swallowed. But they're not here right now and you need it. They won't know if you have it, he tried. Katsuki shook his head. He'll know. They'll punish you. A single tear fell onto the floor in between them, and Izuku wiped his cheek upon realizing it had come from him. "Stop it," he muttered. Katsuki gave a questioning grunt, and Izuku gritted his teeth. "Stop it." Katsuki didn't react as he grabbed the bowl of long cold oatmeal, throwing it as hard as he could and watching in satisfaction as it clashed against the ball of the cell, the sloppy mess coating the metal and dripping to the ground. "You're wasting your food," Katsuki said quietly, barely acknowledging Izuku's frustrated state. "You've hit me, burned me, shoved me, told me I was nothing dash." Something in his heart was telling him to stop, to look at what Katsuki was going through and to swallow down the unneeded rage that kept threatening to devour him whole. He ignored it. "You told me to kill myself, and now all of a sudden you're letting yourself die, to waste away. Just to stop me from getting a little hurt? Why?" he demanded. "What changed? Why does my life suddenly matter to you? Why do you suddenly give a f about my well-being?" Katsuki sighed. If this was happening in any other situation, he'd probably be screaming back, yelling and arguing with Izuku like his life depended on it. But his energy had been constantly drained since they woke up here, without chance of a reprieve. It was all he could do to sit up. "I never stopped." "Bullshit." Izuku spat. "No." Katsuki snapped, suddenly, finally, gaining some sort of recognizable fire in his tone, resembling at least something of the Katsuki that Izuku knew. "Not bullshit. I don't care if you can't accept it, I know it doesn't make sense, but that's what I've made my peace with. I'm stuck giving a shit about you, always have and always will, whether or not you hate me for it." Izuku lunged forward, eyes hard and ignoring how the metal cuff pulled hard at his wrists, restraining him only centimeters from Katsuki's face. Neither of them flinched. "Then why have you always made my life a living hell?" he yelled. Katsuki's response was instantaneous, only quieter because his vocal cords were no longer strong enough to carry the years-long rage that Izuku could. "Because if I didn't, then you'd just do it to yourself." Izuku opened his mouth to respond and paused. Katsuki didn't let up in his glare, and anger was placed with confusion. He fell back onto the heels of his feet, giving them both enough space to breathe. Katsuki rolled his eyes, slumping in on himself further and reaching up to rub his eyes with the back of his blistered, stinging hands. "What on earth is that supposed to mean?" "Exactly what I said, dipshit. I'm not dealing with this right now. Have your midlife crisis or whatever, have it another time." Katsuki waved him off, and Izuku narrowed his eyes. No, you said I'd do it to myself, what were you talking about?" Katsuki leveled tired, irritated eyes at him. "When you found out you were quirkless, you stopped being yourself. Full of self-pity, or whatever. It was insufferable. Nobody else gave a shit, Deku. They had their own lives, they didn't give a f that you didn't have a quirk. But you were too filled with self-hatred over the FING thing to see it. In your shitty mind, everyone was against you and you were nothing." Izuku gaped. "That's not true. Everybody hated me, they all called me weak and useless, and Deku. Just like you." "No, fucker. Think back for a goddamn second. The first person to call you weak, to label you useless, was you. I started calling you Deku because at least that was a FING name, and not the bullshit insults you referred to yourself as all the FING time." Izuku opened his mouth to retort, to prove the blonde wrong, to say anything that would let him gain control of the conversation again. He couldn't. It wouldn't have been that big of a deal, but you made it one. You kept crying and complaining and whining about how your shitty effing dream was ruined. Nothing would snap you out of it. So you decided to turn my greatest fears into reality? Izuku challenged. You decided the best way to deal with my life falling apart was to stomp on the remains? I did it to get you to shut up. Katsuki snapped, before turning his head to the side and breaking into a coughing fit. When he finished, he spat a glob of saliva mixed with blood onto the ground next to him, turning to Izuku with a sneer. You wouldn't stop with the self-pity, so I made your insecurities a reality. The only way you would ever stop pitying yourself and actually do anything was if I made you want to do it out of spite. Spite at the world for making you quirkless apparently wasn't enough, so I made you want to spite me instead. Face it, almost all of the motivation that's gotten you this far has been wanting to prove wrong. Izuku stared at him, for once not even a single word coming to mind. I'm not offending. I'm not saying I didn't F up. I hurt you, and I said shit that can never be taken back. I took it too far, I know. But don't you ever say I did it because I hate you. Because I don't. Quiet reigned over the cell. Tense, sharp, and full of bitterness from the past. Izuku felt a little dizzy, like he'd just gotten off an elevator and could still feel the ghost of the vertical movements through his steps as he tried to walk away. But he couldn't walk away from this. They were quite literally chained to the conversation. Here was Katsuki, the boy who had beat on, and mocked, and made Izuku's life as hard as he could. And he was actively killing himself in one of the most painful ways possible just so Izuku wouldn't have to get hurt. And here was Izuku, the kid who had believed for years that his friendship with Katsuki had died long ago, that he was doomed to be on the other boys' sheet list for the rest of his life, and he was only just finding out that the same kid had been rooting for him the entire time. What was he supposed to do with that information? You thought I had what it took to be a hero? Even without a quirk? His voice was numb, sounding far away, as if it wasn't him saying it. Katsuki scoffed. You've always been capable, too fing capable. That's why it set me off that you wouldn't effing see it. Izuku breathed. You believed in me. Being as that's what I just effing said, yes, you've always been able to be a goddamn hero. Guess it just took FNG all might to get it through your thick skull. Izuku stared forward, motionless. Katsuki scanned him, seeming to want to say something more, to break the uneasy new ground that their relationship was shakily forming. Instead, he let himself scoot back towards the wall, collapsing against it and almost instantly crashing onto his side, allowing his head to rest upon the hard floor. Izuku said nothing. The only noise was the steady glop of old oatmeal still occasionally dripping from the bars, the abandoned plastic bowl lying nearby. For F-, in the back of his mind, Izuku took notice of how weird it was to hear Katsuki stumble over his words, somebody who was usually so sure of himself. For what it's worth, which I'm aware is jack shit, I'm sorry for the bullshit I put you through. I did it because I cared, but that doesn't make it right. I was a stupid kid who wanted you back to normal, and I went about it in the worst way possible. Izuku's eyes wandered over to the slumped-over, injured figure. Why are you suddenly now telling me this? I don't know. There was a small shuffle, a half-hearted attempt to shrug his shoulders even from his sideways position on the ground. Guess I'm too tired to fight your dumb butt. Izuku hummed. You believed in me. He wasn't even speaking to Katsuki at this point, just mumbling to himself, as if assuring himself that he had actually been told those things, and he wasn't hallucinating. You believe in me. And you're protecting me. There was silence for a moment. Sorry. It was a tired, almost incoherent mutter, barely audible and falling out of Katsuki's mouth as he was lulled into a restless sleep that his battered body desperately needed. It was probably said without a thought, and yet that was what finally broke through to Izuku, what finally got to him. It didn't matter that Katsuki had given a longer, more meaningful apology only seconds before. It was this that was the last straw that cut the last string. Izuku looked at the bloodied, beaten, unconscious body of the boy who had both hurt him, and who was giving everything he had just to keep him safe. The boy who had constantly told him he was worthless, and who had always believed in his potential. Katsuki. His Kaken. Izuku looked at him, and he allowed himself to silently sob. It starts like this. There are two boys. Both want to be heroes. One of them gains the quirk, explosion, and knows his dream is right around the corner. The other is diagnosed as quirkless and begins to drown in his own self-despair, sure that his dream is dead. He refuses to see the other possibilities out there, the idea of pursuing his dream without a quirk, and becomes blind with self-hatred. The first boy doesn't understand this, and can see clearly just how possible this dream is for the second boy, and so he tries to throw him a lifeline. He tries to get the second boy to start swimming for safety, to begin to work towards the other options instead of crying about his lack of quirk. The drowning boy ignores him, unable to see anything but his own uselessness. And so the first boy decides to try another route, He starts disrupting the water. At first, the second boy accepts this with welcome arms. The way waves are battered against him, the way the other boy begins to make life so difficult. After all, this is just what he believes about himself, so it makes sense that everybody else believes it too, right? But then the waves get higher, get angrier, and they don't subside with time, like the second boy expected. The first boy, the one who used to be his friend, now always seems so angry with him, always trying to push him under the water, yelling about how his own dream is easy, and how he's so much better. And slowly, something inside the drowning boy's heart changes. Some sort of spiteful anger, sparks his dream back to life. And so he fights. He starts to swim against his old friend's waves, to put everything he had into his dream, hoping that he could still make it. And he does. He finds a way. He disrupts all those old beliefs about being useless, about having nothing, and he gets out of the water. He walks away from the first boy, away from the obstacles that had been thrown at him his entire life. He moves forward. And he never sees the proud smile that the first boy wore, watching him walk away. Time blurs together. There were no clocks, no natural light to indicate the day cycle. Izuku's only way of tracking the time is the too frequent visits from the surgeon. When Katsuki once again refuses to let Izuku be taken, and goes in his place. He was losing more and more energy every time he went, the continued abuse piling up against the small amount of time he got to rest before the next visit. Izuku begged to be taken in place of him. He was always denied. He slumps against the wall, defeated, clutching the puncture wound in his arm as Katsuki gets wheeled away once more. He doesn't feel that he should be allowed to complain about the quirk-canceling drag that gets forced into his system so regularly. Not when he knows what Katsuki was going through is so much worse. Katsuki doesn't even have it in him to tell the surgeon to F off anymore. Izuku knows that's a bad sign. No matter what, Katsuki had always taken care to be as verbally abrasive as possible. Even if he was paralyzed from the neck down, he would still insult the people around him as much as he could. It was just what he did. The fact that he'd given up on that habit was proof that the torture was getting to him. Izuku's best guess was that they would be visited around once a day, maybe twice depending on how well Katsuki was holding up. Most of the time when Katsuki was returned he would just collapse against the wall, or rather would gingerly try to find a place to sleep without aggravating his injuries. Izuku would rush forward, unable to give full comfort because of the stupid FING chain holding him back, and would try his best to engage the blonde, to gauge how well he was doing, and to see if there were any wounds or injuries that the surgeon hadn't taken care of. For the most part, it seemed that the surgeon was at least trying to keep Katsuki going for as long as possible, despite the constant torture and refusal to let him properly recover from it. He was proficient and professional, expertly stitching and wrapping whatever abuse he inflicted onto Katsuki's body, but he was also smart about it. He only ever did the bare minimum to keep Katsuki functional, conscious, and living. Not enough to help him recover mentally, or to even fully take care of his injuries. Clearly, the surgeon knew it was in his best interest to keep Katsuki docile and easy to control. With Izuku, all he needed for that was to get rid of his quirk, but for Katsuki he needed more DSPN. So Izuku spent countless hours sitting, waiting, wishing that the people at UA would hurry up and finally find them. He wasn't stupid, he knew there was only so much of this that Katsuki could take. They needed to get away fast before it became impossible. After the 11th session, Katsuki was returned to their cell already unconscious. He was dumped on the floor away from the wall, the metal shackle dragged over and reattached while Izuku stared at his degrading body in horror. The second they were alone again he scrambled over, almost falling flat on his face when he reached the end of his chain and was pulled back. Luckily, the interns had been less and less careful with Katsuki over their past few handlings of him, probably due to the growing confidence that he was in no way capable of causing them harm anymore. They had pretty much only dragged him as far into the cell as they physically had to for the chain to reach, leaving him sprawled out on the cold stone floor in the middle of the cell, his arms spread out and smudging blood from where it was already seeping through the soaked bandages. The metallic smell in their prison was starting to become overpowering, and if it wasn't for the faint antiseptic scent that assured sanitized medical equipment was being used and the wounds being thoroughly cleaned, Izuku would be worried about impending infections. Katsuki was laying on his back, leaving his chest exposed and open to the stale air. Izuku's breath hitched at the sight. Unlike the arms, which seemed to be a favorite of the surgeon, Katsuki's chest had been left untouched for the few most recent sessions, which meant that the bandages and medical wraps that adorned the rest of his body had apparently been deemed unneeded, giving Izuku one of those rare glimpses into the aftermath of what that psychopath called research. His skin was littered in scars, angry and raised red, barely even healed. His stomach had a large incision across it, neatly stitched up with black string, although whether it was originally black or it had been dyed that way by Katsuki's blood, Izuku didn't know. There were burn marks spattered about, looking as if somebody had splashed boiling oil or acid, leaving it to eat away at Katsuki's skin and leaving patterns like fireworks exploding in the sky. He was clearly losing weight too. Whatever sustenance he was being given during the sessions to keep his body from shutting down wasn't as effective as Izuku hoped it would be, his ribs starting to become more and more prominent as his already pushed to the limit body withered away, unable to keep up with its surroundings. And there was absolutely nothing Izuku could do about it. He could only kneel there, hands stretched out just enough to clasp the edges of his classmates' limp fingers, silent teardrops dripping to the ground in between them. Katsuki woke what felt like an age later, but it was probably only an hour at most. "How long have you been sitting there like a nerd?" Izuku startled at the rough, barely audible, cracking voice. He opened his eyes from where he had been clenching them shut to stop the tears, looking up and over to Katsuki's face. His eyes looked heavy, deep black circles underneath them, but somehow the blonde still managed to show a little bit of amusement in his gaze, glancing at where their hands were still intertwined before looking back up at Izuku judgmentally. He could only attempt to hide his sorrow at how obvious it was that Katsuki was barely holding on. Never in a million years would the normal Katsuki just lie there and allow somebody to hold his hand like that. It was somehow. Izuku still refused to let go. "You can't keep this up, Kaken," he whispered. You can't keep doing this." Katsuki didn't answer. It was silent. Izuku swallowed. He opened his mouth, hesitating. I forgive you." Katsuki's eyebrows furrowed, his head tilting ever so slightly towards him in question. "For all the everything you used to do to me growing up. All the things you said to, I forgive you for them." He waited, barely able to look the blonde in the eye. "Don't." Izuku's eyes widened. "What? Don't forgive me. Don't. What? Why dash? I'm not having your bullshit, guilt-ridden forgiveness. I'm choosing to go through this, it's not your fault." Izuku gaped. "But I didn't dash. The way I treated you was F'd." Katsuki barreled on, coughing and interrupting before Izuku could get another word in. "I knew it was F'd up and I still did it. I never apologized and I never explained. You can't just wash that away because you think I got hurt for you. I'm not taking that. It wasn't okay." Katsuki stared at him, eyes determined despite the pain he must be in. There was a pause as his words sunk in, until Izuku's eyes narrowed and he dropped Katsuki's hand, instead pointing it at his face. "You don't get to decide that. Huh. You wanted me to stick up for myself, but you still act like you know better than me." His voice got slightly louder, Katsuki looking confused by his annoyance. "If I say I forgive you, you aren't allowed to decide why I'm doing it, and you definitely don't get to tell me not to." He snapped, voice raising into a yell. "I know the way you treated me wasn't right. I'm not stupid. I'm forgiving you because I want to, because I know that you aren't that bully that used to burn me on the playground. If you don't think I'm worthless, and you're really sorry, then and you prove it by showing you trust me to have my own opinion and accept my FNG forgiveness." Izuku's chest rose and fell as he heaved. He felt lighter, although a part of him winced at yelling in such a situation. He usually opted for being more peaceful, but something about this situation just kept bubbling up inside of him. He had nothing to do but think in this stupid cell, all the while knowing that Katsuki was just down the call being cut into, or burned, or whatever it was that happened during those sessions. He was quite literally forced to meditate on his relationship with the blonde, and while he knew that things would never be as they were when they were kids before he found out he was quirkless, he also found that he didn't really want that anyway. They were different people from back then. They'd both made a lot of mistakes, ones that affected both themselves and each other. But if they were going to grow and learn and mend their twisted relationship, then they needed to start actually talking, instead of making assumptions about the other. That was what had gotten them into this mess in the first place. God, how effed up did their relationship have to be that out of that and being kidnapped, his friendship with Katsuki was what Izuku first considered to be the bigger mess? Katsuki stared at him, eyes wide in surprise at the sudden outburst. His mouth dropped open slightly as Izuku fought to catch his breath, having almost forgotten to breathe during his little tangent. Finally, after what seemed like forever, he swallowed, liking his cracked lips and nodding slightly. Sheet. I accept your forgiveness. Izuku's mind went blank. Oh. Katsuki squinted as he slumped in on himself. Oh. I mean he stuttered. I guess, I just didn't really expect you to agree. Thank you. Right. Yeah. They delved into quiet once more. You know, this whole breakthrough would be so much better if I didn't feel like I was FNG dying through it. Katsuki muttered. Izuku sighed. I don't suppose now you respect my opinion that you'll let me pick who gets taken the next time the surgeon visits? I don't respect it that much. Izuku slumped even further at the poor attempt at a joke. I thought so. He shifted, curling his legs out underneath him and lying down, keeping his shackled arms stretched out towards the wall and gingerly laying his head on Katsuki's leg, moving slowly and being careful not to put weight on any injuries. We have to get you out of here, he whispered into the quiet of the cell, both of them laying there in the middle of the room like two koi fish twisted around each other, seeking silent comfort. Katsuki didn't respond, but after a moment Izuku felt a hand reach over and grasp his own unchained one, connecting them in a quiet solidarity, a promise. He doesn't know how long they stayed like that, but it was the first time since they had first woken up in that cell that Izuku hadn't felt completely unsafe while falling asleep. It became the only way they could really rest. The physical contact, as limited as it was, became a lifeline. Without it, they had nothing to cling on to. The few times that Katsuki got taken away while Izuku was asleep were the worst. Waking up to an empty cell, the other boy nowhere in sight, sent him into a deep panic that could last from minutes to hours. The interns tried to collect him during one of these panic attacks, and in his mass hysteria he forgot the rules that had been drilled into his head, kicking out and slamming his foot into the kneecap of one of his handlers. His punishment was enough to snap him out of it. When Katsuki was returned to the cell and saw the large bruises covering his face, he was sent into his own frenzy, clearly panicking at the thought of whatever caused his own bruising to have happened to Izuku. Their only comforts were each other, and the longer they were isolated like that, the more dependable on each other they became. You know, your mom asked me to keep you safe once. Huh. Izuku looked up at Katsuki across the cell warily. It was one of the bad days. The days where whatever was being done to Katsuki really got to him, and he was returned not completely sure of anything going on around him. On some days it was hard for him to even remember his own name, something that scared Izuku to his very core. On other days, he came back and became adverse to all touch, as if even Izuku's gentle comforts were reminders of the horrors that awaited him in whatever room was down that hall. On days like these, Izuku had learned that it was better for Katsuki to just be left alone, to allow his mind to slowly heal as much as it could, while it rationalized whatever had just happened. These days were spent in silence, sitting facing each other on opposite walls, just waiting, though neither knew what they were waiting for anymore. Your mom, Auntie Inko? Katsuki was staring resolutely at the ground as he spoke, picking at the bandages around his neck. Izuku nodded, silently begging for him to continue. The mention of anyone they knew outside of this place was a good sign, because it meant that Katsuki wasn't forgetting anything this time around. She asked me to protect you. You mean back when we were kids? No. Izuku looked at him, confused. The day you got your acceptance into UA. What? She ran into me at the store, asked if I'd gotten in too. His voice was quiet, but Izuku hung onto every word as if they would free him from his bindings and rescue them both. She said you got accepted. Asked me to keep an eye on you, make sure you didn't get into any trouble. What did you say back? He couldn't help but ask. Katsuki finally looked up at him, eyes red from both exhaustion and tears. I promised I wouldn't let you get hurt. Izuku stopped counting the sessions after the 15th one. It was too painful to remember each and every time he had to watch Katsuki get taken away. His time with Katsuki was starting to get harder to keep track of. He could never tell if they were safe for another night or if the surgeon was about to come see them again. He hated not knowing. He hated that Katsuki seemed to lose a part of himself every time he got taken away. He hated that there was still no hesitation when Katsuki chose himself for the next round. Even when he was still so fed up from the previous session that he wasn't 100% sure what he was picking himself for. One time he was brought back to the cell, and he sat silently, frozen for a long time. Izuku didn't know what to do, just watching and hoping that this wouldn't be one of the days where he'd freak out. And then Katsuki looked up at him, a lost expression on his face. Am I Kaken? I can't Kaken and Deku. That's us, right? Am I Kaken? Izuku broke. Katsuki stared at him, not taking notice of the tears running down his face. Yeah, he eventually whimpered. You're Kaken and I'm Deku. Katsuki nodded, repeating his words to himself quietly. Right, have to remember that. Izuku cried even harder. A few sessions after that, Katsuki was smiling when he was returned to the cell. Izuku was worried that he'd been given a new sort of drag at first, until Katsuki unwound his bandages on his chest, just below his collarbone, and Izuku's face dropped. He let me pick what he carved. Now I won't forget. Katsuki coughed, putting the reddened bandages back carefully. Izuku sniffed. I'm so sorry, it was all he felt he could say. Katsuki didn't seem to think the apology was necessary, still dazed from his session with the surgeon. He continued to wind the bandages around his cuts slowly, methodically, covering up inch by inch the new incisions that had been made, letters permanently etched into his skin. Kaken. And just below it, blood still bubbling from how recent it was. Katsuki finds it hard to remember a lot of things recently. The only things he can be sure of is the pain, the experiments, and the fact that as long as he's the one feeling them, then Deku is safe. Time doesn't make sense to him. He is aware of the surgeon, coming to the cell and asking for his decision, to which he knows the correct answer is always himself. Never Deku. He is aware of being carried onto that stupid FNG table, being rolled down the corridor, held down and then lifted up, taken into a different, white, clean-swept room. Strapped onto tables, sometimes vertical, mostly horizontal. He is injected with a drag that paralyses his arms and legs, and the surgeon will prepare his tools. The surgeon likes to talk about what he's doing while he does it. It's usually just them during the sessions, and Katsuki doesn't think he's the one the explanations are being directed towards, so he must just like talking to himself. He talks about wanting to truly delve into the science behind quirks and decides that Katsuki's quirk is a good way to do it. He slices into Katsuki. He explores the insides of his hands and his arms and everything that he thinks might be connected to the workings of Katsuki's quirk. He does not give Katsuki any sort of drag to stop the pain. He says that he cannot risk the chance that pain has some sort of effect on the way his quirk works, and so Katsuki must feel it. After he's done slicing, cutting, and carving deeply into Katsuki's skin, sending slow, agonizingly hot waves of pain shooting through him, and he decides he's gotten enough data for that session, he'll quickly wipe away the majority of the blood, just enough to allow him to see what he's working with, and he'll attempt to fix the mess he's made of Katsuki's body. Masses of fabric and bandages are wrapped tightly around him, stitches are applied, and he's warned not to pull any of them too hard. Sometimes he decides to experiment with more biological aspects of Katsuki's quirk. Those are the worst. The surgeon had a large glass cabinet next to the tool station where he kept his scalpels, knives, screws, and other assorted torture weapons. The cabinet is where he keeps his favorite concoctions. Katsuki learned pretty early on that the surgeon liked to create his own medication. His specific interests seemed to be quirk medications. He had already perfected his quirk-disabling agent, as was proven by the fact that Deku had yet to Hulk smash his way out of those stupid FNG chains, but he saved his more volatile drags for his lab, as he called it. Katsuki called it his torture room, but whatever. The drags effed with his head. A lot. Some of them made his head fuzzy, like he was underwater. Others just made him confused, jumbling his mind until he didn't know what way was up or even what his name was, and those were the scary ones, the ones that destroyed any ounce of control Katsuki had, something that terrified him more than anything. He knew it scared Deku too, when the last of the drags would finally wear off and there were those blissful few hours between sessions where he had already partially recovered and got to spend a small amount of time being him again, before the process started from the beginning. He would remember flashes of what had occurred while he was under the influence, and see glimpses of the way Deku reacted to it. He hated it. He hated that Deku was there to witness it even more. The most painful ones were the ones that focused on the workings of his quirk. That bubbly red substance that when injected into his skin would take over the sweat stored up inside his veins, and force his already eruptive quirk into uncontrollable use. Mixed with the quirk-canceling drag he was constantly under the influence of, it caused his quirk to spiral out of control, explosions pouring out of his hands and burning the skin off anything nearby. He lost count of the amount of times he'd been strapped to that stupid FNG table, voice broken and raw from the amount of screaming he'd done, acidy liquid leaking out of the blisters on his palms as he desperately tried to ignore the feeling of his skin disintegrating underneath its touch. The surgeon loved it. That was his favorite drag. He said the effect it had on him was fascinating. Katsuki hated him more than anything in the world. He had no clue how long he'd been under the control of that psychopath, strapped down and broken over and over and over and over, until there was barely anything of him left. But lately the surgeon had been getting more and more sloppy. He'd been irresponsible, destructive, more and more uncaring about the condition he left Katsuki in. He knew Deku had noticed. The boy was having panic attacks every time Katsuki even left his eyesight, and he kept begging to be given a session in Katsuki's place. That wasn't an option for Katsuki. Not when he knew how bad they were. He couldn't let that happen. Ever. Even if it killed him. You're reaching the end, kid. I hate to say it, but it's true. He could barely hear the surgeon's words over the pain. The last few days? Hours? Who FNG knew, but whatever it had been terrible. He hadn't slept. He had only really started to clear his head from the last session a few minutes before this one started, and it wasn't the first time that had happened recently. He kept forgetting who he was, what was going on, and why he was doing it. Feeling the raised bumps of the scarred letters on his collarbone had become a F-ed-up sort of comfort, although he knew it messed with Deku's head every time he saw a glimpse of it. There had been that one time his bandages had been covering it and in his messed-up state of mind he'd had a little bit of a freak-out about it, and Deku had almost dislocated his own arm reaching far enough to pull them away so he could guide Katsuki's hand to feel them again, though, so he thinks that he's starting to get it. Deku had certainly formed his own attachments. He kept hyperventilating, and when he got in a bad state of mind where he couldn't even see anything, feeling the bandages covering Katsuki's wrists always snapped him out of it. The sad thing was, Katsuki understood it. It had become a staple of him now, so when Izuku couldn't trust whether or not he could see Katsuki, he was able to settle for the familiar feel of stretchy fabric to calm him down. It seemed that neither of them had managed to get away from this living situation unscathed. Pain coursed through his entire body like lightning, muscles seizing up as it desperately tried to reject the effect of whatever new drag the surgeon had decided to test on him. Whatever it was, it didn't agree with Katsuki's body, making him feel as if his blood had been turned to lava, burning away at his insides in a never-ending circuit that tore away at his very self. He wished his arms weren't strapped to his sides so he could feel up to his scars. Feeling those letters would be a really good reminder as to why he had to get through this. His body felt like it was failing. It had felt like that for a while now, but he'd been pushing on, determined to get through to the other side. Now though, on this particular session, he was just at the end of his tether. His mind was frayed, body used up. He was tired, barely awake despite the drag the surgeon usually administered specifically to keep him conscious during sessions, and even registering his torturer's words was a chore he didn't feel capable of completing. "I didn't think you'd last this long, to be honest," he thought he heard, although his mind was so F-ed it might have been a hallucination. His eyes were open, but all he could see was red. He didn't know if it was the blood in his eyes or an effect of the drag, but everything was wavy, and tinged with dark red. That's why I rushed to gather all this data from you, because I didn't think we'd have as long to work together as we did. But I guess you're all used up now. That's okay, it was never really you I wanted. His mind was so fuzzy. He couldn't even feel his body anymore. The pain had skyrocketed him into a weightless state, letting him float just on the edges of unconsciousness. A faint click registered somewhere in the back of his mind, but he didn't pay attention to it. When I worked temporarily with the League, I heard them talking about that Midoriya kid. You know what they called him? All Might's protege. There was a thud, the sound of something dripping. Somebody known as that must have an amazing quirk. I simply couldn't live with myself if I passed up the opportunity to examine him, to figure out how his quirk ticked. I never expected you to disrupt our collection of him, though. There was something. He couldn't feel the slight padded top of the research table underneath his head anymore. His limbs were more relaxed, like the drags were wearing off ever so slowly. It didn't matter though, the surgeon hadn't bothered fixing him up this time. He was bleeding out. He'd finally reached his limit. He'd be dead soon. It was a happy little accident though. You've provided some really important research for my data bank, and you've helped break down our little guest with your protection stunt. He'll be much more malleable to my demands now I can hold your death over his head. The redness was starting to fade. He could feel the faint stickiness of his blood-coated fingers. His view was different. He could see the surgeon further above him than usual. Was he on a ladder? Was Katsuki on the floor? Did it matter? Still, now that you've been used up, just think of that information I can get from him. His body's workings must be so fascinating, what with the amount of strength it had to contain for his quirk to work. All that power. Able to be turned on and off like a light switch. I want to know why. Who cared about any of it? Who is he again? He was supposed to be feeling pain. Wasn't he? What was that for? Why was it so important? Did it matter any more? Was it over? It felt like it was over. Maybe he finished whatever he was supposed to do. He was tired. He could take a break, right? But let it all go? Yeah. Just let it all go. I wonder if he'll want those same silly nicknames on himself, as a reminder? Huh, Kaken? You think Deku will want to immortalize you on his skin? Faintly, Katsuki felt some sort of clarity return to him, remembering that green head of hair that was waiting for him back in their cell. That was why he was fighting to stay alive, that's why he was still here. Because despite everything he had put Deku through, all the misguided hatred and bullshit threats, the bullying and the taunting, the outright abuse that he had caused the younger, he had always cared. And now, somehow, they had gotten to a point where it seemed like they might have cleared the air. They could have a chance to reconcile, to move on from their past and at least attempt to rekindle the friendship that Katsuki tried so hard to keep going before. He'd gone about it the wrong way when they were younger, he knew that. Had known it for a long time, despite the fact that he never stopped. But now was different. Now Deku was starting to become Deku again, and they might have a chance. But if Katsuki died here? Under the surgeon's hands in the name of keeping Deku away from danger? He knew the green-headed brat would drown himself in guilt. Katsuki didn't spend all this time trying to force Deku out of the water only to have the dumbass dive right back in the second he turned his back. He wasn't dying like this. He wasn't dying here. He wasn't going to leave Deku to the same fate that he had been suffering ever since they had woken up here. Clearly, the surgeon had originally intended to only take Deku, but somehow Katsuki had been taken at the last moment. He couldn't remember how, but he thanked he was, because it had meant that he was the one that was used first. Obviously the surgeon had decided to use up the extra, and wasn't it weird, him of all people being considered the extra for once, before moving on with his original plans. Katsuki couldn't let that happen. He'd promised Inko and he'd promised himself. Somehow, Katsuki used his last sliver of strength to ground himself, cracking his eyes open and trying to take stock of his surroundings. He had been right, he was on the floor. Just a crumpled, almost dead form, covered in blood and abandoned to his fate so that the surgeon could prepare the table for his next victim. A familiar well of anger started to grow within Katsuki. How often dare he, after everything he had done, have the audacity to just throw Katsuki into the corner without even checking that he was thoroughly dead? Slowly, barely, Katsuki started to shift. Making sure the surgeon's back was turned and he wasn't taking notice of him, he tried to position himself so he could take stock of his surroundings. They were the only two in the lab, and Katsuki was free. This would probably be his only chance to get away and get Deku out of there. He spotted the cabinet. Next to it, there was a metal bin, one that Katsuki recognized as the box the surgeon disposed of his used syringes in. He could probably drag himself over to it if he was quick enough. The surgeon's back was still turned. Katsuki's mind was still clouded, that his only thought was the morbidly amusing note that the blood still leaking out of his chest, arms, and wherever else had been focused on most recently, made it easier to slowly, pathetically slide himself along the tiled floor and towards the metal bin. There were still some of the syringes inside. Those large, sharp needles that Katsuki had gotten used to the feel of far too quickly. He was shaking as he lifted himself up with one arm, the other only just having the energy to flop over the rim of the metal bin and grabbing blindly for a needle. He didn't know if it was sweat or blood that he blinked out of his eyes as he finally grasped one of them, painstakingly dragging it back up and out of the bin, into his grasp. The edge of the needle made a scrapey sound as it was dragged against the side of the container, and Katsuki knew he had to hurry, shoving the needle behind his back. How did you get over there? The surgeon gave him a bemused look from where he was standing at the table, glancing at the trail of smudged blood that Katsuki had left, to the glass cabinet he was trying to lean himself up against. "Ah," he said, clarity flashing on his face. He pushed his glasses up on his nose, smiling down at the crumpled teen. "You're looking for one of my medications to help you escape? I'm afraid there isn't a cure for the quirk disabler, you simply have to wait for it to wear off. But something tells me you won't last that long." Katsuki didn't respond as he watched his captor carefully, focusing on breathing in and out and trying not to collapse, his energy fast draining. He still had some things left to do, he couldn't stop just yet. "Honestly, I'd thought you'd already kicked the bucket, but you never fail to surprise me, do you, Bakugo?" The surgeon grinned, before shaking his head fondly and reaching onto the counter nearby, where he kept his precious tools. "I'm afraid you've already been as useful to my research as you could possibly be, though, so I need to dispose of you. You should die happy, Bakugo. You were way tougher than I gave you credit for." Katsuki's breathing got heavier as the surgeon started towards him, brandishing one of his larger scalpels, the very same one that had carved Katsuki's lifeline into the skin on his chest. He watched intently, not trying to move or run away, waiting and hoping for the right chance to appear. The surgeon leant down in front of him, pointing the scalpel at his bloodied forehead. "As a thank you for your cooperation, I'll make it as painless as possible. Straight through the head and into the thalamus." Katsuki waited for the last possible moment, when he saw the muscles in the surgeon's hands tense in preparation for the strike, and then he gathered all his strength, ignoring the blinding pain every movement caused him. And he lunged. He ducked his head under the surgeon's hand, bringing his arm out from behind his back and swiping wildly in an arc towards his neck, needle poised like a dagger. There was a splatter, a gagging sound, and Katsuki felt a gush of hot, thick liquid splash across his face and body. He looked up just as his captor dropped the scalpel, his hand desperately coming up to clutch at his own wound. The bloodied needle lay limp in Katsuki's arm, and he watched as the large slash directly across the surgeon's throat opened up, blood flooding out like a waterfall. The surgeon fell back, gagging and choking on his own blood as it cascaded out of him, even faster than Katsuki's injuries had drained him during the sessions. It was with a sick sort of satisfaction that Katsuki got to watch the life fade out of his torturer's face, collapsed on the lab's floor in a growing lake of his own blood. His body twitched a few times, a quiet sking sound emerging from the opening across his jugular, before his arms fell limp at his sides. Katsuki stared. He sat there for a minute just watching. Just looking at the mess he'd created, at the proof that he was free. Or he would be free if he managed to make it out without joining the surgeon in bleeding to death. He dragged himself forward, moving his hand into the pocket of the dead man's jacket, where he knew the key to their cell was kept, grabbing it before turning to the lab door. He had to hurry. This was the sort of time that the sessions usually ended, when the interns would arrive to help return him to their cell. He didn't know what they would do when they found out their leader had been murdered, but he didn't particularly think they'd just show him the door and wave him away. Slowly, Katsuki reached up to grip the edge of the table he had been strapped down to so many times. Bloody syringe in one hand, keys in the other, he dragged himself up until he was bent over the cool metal, gasping for breath as the pain of jostling his injuries caused tears to spring into his eyes. The stitches on his abdomen had been torn, he knew, and his arms were still blistered and bleeding from various incisions. His palms had hardened somewhat, more scabbed than blistered, which was somewhat of a relief, but he still probably wouldn't be able to use his quirk for a while, even once the drag wore off. He took a second to just stand there, trying to get used to being on his own feet again, knees shaking and barely even able to hold himself up. Then, he turned to the door, and stumbled towards it, pushing it open and starting in the direction he knew Deku was. His vision started to get a little blurry halfway there, his steps more uneven despite his efforts of using the wall to keep him up. He must have not ducked quick enough, because there was still a sizable cut on his forehead that, although was shallow enough to not be an issue, was still dripping blood down his face and into his eyes, making it harder to see. He couldn't stop yet. He just had to keep going, had to help. Kaken? Katsuki fell, the unconsciousness that had been threatening him finally winning out. Katsuki was running out of strength. Izuku knew that. He was barely holding on, and he was only getting worse. Izuku decided right then as he watched Katsuki get wheeled away for the umpteenth time, that he couldn't just sit and hope any longer. They couldn't afford to wait for other people to come save them. Katsuki needed to get out now. Katsuki had literally told him that he'd always known Izuku had potential, that he didn't need a quirk to be a hero. And yet here Izuku was, sitting here and wallowing just like when they were kids. It was pathetic. He wasn't falling into that again. The only available time where Izuku could possibly get away from the cell was when he was being handled by the interns. If he could somehow find a way to get away from them and towards some sort of weapon, he might just be able to get to Katsuki before things got too bad. He hoped he had enough time. He couldn't bear losing his Kaken, not when he'd only just gotten him back. The interns came in as they usually did, dumping a small amount of food and water in front of him. Izuku stayed quiet and still while one of the interns unlocked the shackle on his arm, the other holding onto his other arm with an iron-tight grip. He stayed and he waited for a chance to appear. He let himself be dragged to that disgusting bathroom, one ear desperately trying to hear any sign of life from Katsuki, as horrific as they usually were. He could hear nothing. Izuku just became more determined. He was locked inside the dingy bathroom, spinning around the second he was alone. It was the same as always. He already knew there were no loose objects he could grab, or anything he could defend himself with. Just the old rusty sink and gross-looking toilet. Aware of his dwindling time, Izuku rushed to the toilet. It was a shitty thing, plastic and barely even usable. His first thought had been to tear off the top part of the toilet tank, using it as some sort of heavy brick that he could hit his captors with, but the plastic lid was clearly not something that could do any damage. He scanned the inner workings of the tank desperately, trying to find anything to use against the two interns he knew would open the door any moment now. How could anything inside this stupid room help him? He didn't have enough time to think of a proper plan, and who knew what Katsuki was having to deal with right now. Out of slight despair, Izuku reached into the tank and grabbed the first thing he could, which happened to be a small, slightly stretchy length of pipe, attaching two parts of the toilet flush together. Quickly and quietly, Izuku tugged at it, trying his best to get it out of the tank. He braced his foot against the closed lid and pulled with all his strength, gritting his teeth. He knew even without his quirk this sort of thing probably would have been easy to do before he'd been taken, but after who knew how long trapped in that cell, barely moving or eating, just wasting away, his upper body strength was nothing like it used to be. But thankfully, after a few tugs the pipe came free, like some sort of thick plasticky rope or wire. He had no FING clue what he was supposed to do with this. But it was all he had, so he would have to make it work. He quickly closed the lid of the toilet tank and rushed to the door, standing next to it against the wall and fighting to control his breathing, desperate to make his one chance count. After a few more moments of tense silence, he heard the door being unlocked, and it swung open inwards, hiding Izuku from sight. One of the interns stepped in, head tilting as they scanned the room for his presence. Izuku knew he only had about half a second before he was spotted. He swallowed fearfully, before breathing out and thinking of Katsuki. Izuku lunged. He jumped forward, reaching up with the pipe and throwing it over the intern's head, wrapping it around his neck and pulling tight as hard as he could. He tried not to think about the horrific act he was committing as the intern stumbled, their back hitting the door as they made a faint choking sound, struggling to pull the pipe away from their neck. Izuku did his best to hold his own as the second intern ran in, assessing the situation and reaching for Izuku's hands to free their colleague. Izuku yanked backwards, slamming the intern he was strangling against the sharp edge of the open door and widening his eyes in surprise when they turned slightly, smashing their mask and falling to the ground. It was the same intern that he had first hit that time, their beaked masks still fractured from the punch. The crack grew, the beak part snapping off the mask as they tumbled to the ground. Izuku locked eyes with the loose piece of mask, before dropping underneath the punch the second intern had thrown at him and grabbing it, rushing forward and spinning around to jam the sharp beak edge directly into the back of the second intern's neck. Blood spurted out and he heard a yell, which he barely took notice of. He stared instead, horrified as the second unnamed intern fell forwards, heaping onto their colleague and not moving. "Oh my God," he muttered, shocked at what he just caused. He almost felt faint, standing there in that dingy bathroom, door open and captors unresponsive on the floor. Of course he'd fought people before, used his quirk against people and battled to take people down, but nothing had ever felt so graphic like this. This didn't feel like a heroic fighting move, it just felt like a psychopathic murder scene. He took a deep breath before forcing himself out of it. "Have to help Kaken," he mumbled, refusing to think about it. He ran out of the bathroom and rushed down the hall, past their cell and continuing towards the direction he'd seen Katsuki get wheeled down countless times. He didn't have to get far. "Kaken!" Katsuki, bloodied and beaten, key in one hand and an empty syringe needle in the other, stumbling down the hall towards him. Izuku gasped at the extent of his injuries, at how deathly he looked. And then Katsuki looked up, eyes just about missing eye contact with him, and plunged to the ground unconscious. "Kaken!" Izuku ran towards him in terror, grabbing his face and checking the pulse on his neck to avoid the cuts on his wrist. It was still there, but faint. He didn't know where the surgeon had gone, or how Katsuki had gotten away from him, but if he was going to survive then Izuku needed to get him out now. Using strength he didn't even know he had, Izuku grabbed Katsuki and picked him up, one arm under his knees and the other supporting his head, trying his best to ignore the steady amount of blood staining his clothes and coating his arms. Izuku took in a breath and hurried through the corridor. He didn't stop until he found a way out, only faltering slightly at the half-open door leading to a white-tiled room that stank of metal, eyes dancing over the bloody footsteps coming out from it and the familiar limp hand he could just about see lying on the floor inside. Izuku wasn't the only one who had resorted to horrific methods of escape, then. He didn't know whether or not the sight of the surgeon's dead body should comfort him, so he just kept on forward, focusing on keeping his childhood friend alive, instead. It was by some sort of miracle that he didn't come across any other interns while he traversed the unknown building he was in, until he found a staircase leading upwards towards a rusty, metal door. He didn't want to put Katsuki down for a single second, so he resorted to leaning against the wall and shoving out with his leg to try and get it to budge, before shouldering it open and squeezing through the crack he had managed to make. He emerged to find it to be nighttime, something that caught him off guard slightly. He was in an alleyway, dirty and quiet. The rusty door swung shut into the wall behind him, looking like some sort of sewer maintenance entrance or something. Completely unsuspicious and normal. Nobody would have any reason to suspect the horrors that had occurred to the two boys within. The worst thing, or perhaps it was a good thing considering Katsuki's condition, was that when Izuku left the alleyway he recognized exactly where he was. This whole time, everything they'd been through, the pain and suffering they'd had to endure while praying for rescue, and they had only ever been a few streets away from UA. a few streets away from safety. Izuku didn't know whether to laugh or cry. His arms started to ache, and he instead decided to press on to get to UA as soon as possible. Katsuki needed help, and Izuku wasn't sure how long he could keep this up for. Katsuki was on death's door, but Izuku wasn't exactly unscathed either. He was underfed, overexerted, and weak. His stunt with the interns coupled with the strain of carrying Katsuki for as long as he had was starting to wear on him, not to mention the mental consequences of everything he'd been through. He found it harder and harder to focus on anything but putting one foot in front of the other, mind filled with nothing but getting to safety, letting his instincts direct him. He didn't know how he managed to make it, how nobody else saw two bloodied kids walking down the public streets towards UA, but he managed it. He let out a few tears when he saw the gate, trusting Nedzu's biological scanner to know who they were and allow them safe passage. He barely made it 20 steps into the grounds before his haziness overcame him, eyes struggling to be kept open as he fell to his knees. He was covered in blood, and Katsuki was still bleeding. He needed to help Katsuki. His Kaken needed help. Why wasn't there help? He'd made it, didn't he? This was supposed to be safe. Kiri, come on, curfew's in like 10 minutes, we need to get back to the dorms. Yeah, I'm coming. If? Who's that? I don't, hello? Excuse me, buddy, you alright? Faint voices from far away. They were coming closer. Were they coming to help Kaken? Wait, holy sheet. Midoriya? Mito? Holy effing sheet, is that you dash? What if they were coming to take Kaken away again, though? Oh my god, go get Aizawa-sensei. Holy sheet. The effing blood. Bakugo? Midoriya? What the F happened? No, he was supposed to be safe, he wasn't letting Kaken be taken again. I don't know, man. He won't let Bakugo go, I can't tell if they're okay. I don't want to freak them out. He needed to keep his Kaken away from the danger. Izuku, calm down, it's okay, you're safe. What if they were lying? Tensei, thank if dash. No, they were going to take Kaken away. Midoriya, calm down. No. They couldn't have him, Izuku wouldn't let them. Something was restraining him, and Katsuki was ripped from his grasp. Izuku panicked, yelling out, before there were more voices and a sweet smell invaded his nose. Then there was nothing. It ends like this. Izuku slowly comes to, and he hears a faint beeping somewhere to his left. He feels comfortable, which is not something he is used to, and he can feel the softness of the sheets he is laying on. This is not their cell. The realization sends a wave of panic through him, and he jolts awake, catapulting himself into a sitting position on what turns out to be a medical cot in a nicely decorated room, with an open door in front and multiple chairs to the side. In one of these chairs is All Might, who looks at him with relief and joy, tinged with worry as he recognized the look on Izuku's face. On none of the chairs and nowhere else in the room is Katsuki. Young Midoriya, please, do not be alarmed. You are safe, All Might began, holding up his hands in a placating manner. Izuku ignored him, scrambling out of the bed. Kaken was the only thing he said, frantically scanning the room. Is safe. He's safe, he's in another room, you're in the medical suite at UA, All Might continued. That was all Izuku heard, his breathing becoming heavier as he sprinted out of the room. Kaken! He yelled, ignoring All Might's shouts behind him as he crashed into the wall, surprising the few members of staff milling about the hall as he rushed along, peeking his head into every room he passed. Every room he saw that didn't house Katsuki only delved him deeper into his panic, tears starting to cloud his vision as his desperate yells for Katsuki got louder and more frantic. Deku! Finally, he heard Katsuki's voice somewhere further down the hall, and he ran faster, getting more anxious as he heard multiple people's footsteps and shouts chasing him. Demph, in here. He smashed a door open, chest heaving, his eyes landing on a heavily bandaged Katsuki lying in a similar hospital bed, recovery girl scolding him to stay and lying down even as he was halfway standing. Kaken, Izuku gasped, all his anxious energy draining out of him immediately at the reassurance that Katsuki was okay. He rushed forwards, hands grasping forwards blindly, and Katsuki acquiesced in holding his own hand out, letting himself fall backwards into the bed again as Izuku got as physically close to the blonde as was possible without hurting him. "You weren't. I woke up and you were gone, Idish," he tried to explain, stuttering wildly as the footsteps got closer to Katsuki's room. "Yeah, but I'm here and I'm effing fine, alright?" Katsuki squeezed his hand, and he nodded. "So FING breathe, nerd." Another tear fell from Izuku's eye, and he wiped them with his other hand, refusing to let go of Katsuki. "Young Midoriya." They both turned to see both All Might and Aizawa appearing in the doorway, and Katsuki narrowed his eyes at them. "He told you he'd freak out if I wasn't there when he woke up?" All Might gaped slightly, and Aizawa came further into the room, settling himself down in one of the chairs surrounding Katsuki's bed. Izuku shifted closer to Katsuki on instinct, until he was half sitting on the bed next to him. "I'm sorry for the stress it caused you, but we weren't sure when you would awaken, and we knew that Bakugo needed rest after his surgery." Aizawa looked at Izuku when he spoke, and he narrowed his eyes, head rapidly switching between Katsuki and his teacher. "Surgery? What? I don't understand. What happened?" "Timeline's kinda effed in my head too, if it's any consolation," Katsuki muttered. "What's the last thing you remember?" Izuku paused, thinking back carefully. "I was, in the cell? No, then I got taken out, and I needed to get to you because you were being hurt again, and, He froze suddenly, flashes of what he had done to those two interns crossing his mind. He slammed his eyes shut and squeezed Katsuki's hand harder, shaking his head to get rid of them. "I got away from the people and I found you in the hall? You had gotten away from the surgeon?" All Might and Aizawa watched the two quietly, as Katsuki nodded. "Yeah, I find to kick that guy's butt, finally." It was a poor attempt at putting on a brave face, but Izuku didn't say anything. If anything, Katsuki's clear comfort at their surroundings just helped put him at ease. "Tried to make my way to you to get you out that FING cell, but you'd already done it, I guess. Then I think I passed out." "Yeah, I grabbed you and found the way out, got you to UA, but that's all I remember. Kirishima and Siro found you on their way to the dorms after training. They alerted us." Aizawa finally interrupted. "Midoriya was holding you, Bakugo, and seemed very distressed. You needed medical attention, but he wouldn't allow anyone near you, so we had to restrain and sedate him. You had emergency surgery to deal with the extreme injuries you had sustained, so we put Midoriya in a different room until you had healed. He woke up quicker than we expected, however." Izuku traced his fingers over the grooves in Katsuki's knuckles, allowing himself just a moment to breathe, to look around and remind himself that they were safe, that they had gotten out. "We're out," he whispered, needing some other reassurance, to be sure that he wasn't tricking himself. Katsuki brought his other hand up, eyes unfocused as he slid it under the neck of the hospital shirt they had both been put in, no doubt tracing the lines of his carved scars, a motion that had become so familiar to Izuku over their time in the cell. "Yeah, apparently." Izuku swallowed, turning to All Might and Aizawa, who were watching Katsuki with concern. He wondered if they knew the scars and wounds underneath that shirt. He wondered if they had seen the specific carving that Katsuki was tracing now, the one that Izuku still didn't know how to feel about. Was it bad that he got it? That instead of being horrified that Katsuki had his name carved into his skin, he was just happy that it helped? Of the proof that he meant just as much to Katsuki as the blonde did to him? What happened? Aizawa looked at him as Recovery Girl excused herself from the room, giving Katsuki a once-over and a warning not to leave the bed, which he rolled his eyes at. "We were hoping you two might be able to enlighten us on that." Izuku blinked, shaking his head. "No, I mean before we were kidnapped." We don't," he corrected, Katsuki nodding along. "We don't remember how we were taken." "Don't remember?" All Might repeated, exchanging a glance with Aizawa. "Guy liked his drags," Katsuki said dryly, "Effed with our heads a lot." "He effed with more than your head," Izuku mumbled bitterly, ignoring the light smack Katsuki directed to his arm. All Might looked at him with a slightly shocked expression, probably unused to hearing Izuku curse, but he supposed both he and Katsuki had changed over the time they had spent in the surgeon's clutches. Izuku definitely felt that there had been a lot of moments in the quiet silence of that prison where Katsuki had shown a much softer side of himself, one that Izuku had originally believed to be lost in their early childhoods. "How long has it been?" Katsuki asked, breaking off into a rough-sounding cough. Aizawa got up to hand him a glass of water before hesitating. "You two went missing during a training exercise, about 29 days ago." Katsuki choked on the water, turning to the side as he hacked at the water in his lungs. Izuku sat, frozen, still holding on to Katsuki and refusing to let go. 29 days. They'd been in that cell for a month. A month of Katsuki being constantly tortured, of being isolated and unable to tell what was going on, or whether they would ever escape. It took a month before Izuku finally managed to help his friend. He felt tears welling up in his eyes, and Aizawa looked at him with understanding, sharing a glance with All Might. "We don't know what happened to the two of you during your disappearance." All Might explained. "There was a mass villain attack in the north of Mizudafu, and as the closest heroic school, we decided to allow some of the students to attend the aftermath to help with recovery and civilian damages, as a training opportunity. You were split into pairs and given a radius to search for victims in need of help, with communication devices in case of an emergency. The two of you were paired up, but about an hour into the search you failed to respond to your check-ins, and your comms went dead. Nobody could find you, and we haven't heard from you since, until Midoriya showed up early last night. We understand that whatever happened to the two of you was probably very distressing. Aizawa started, ignoring Katsuki's snort. "And we know you will need time, but for now we need a few details to make sure that it won't happen again." "I don't." Izuku shook his head. I don't want to think about it." He really didn't. He was barely holding himself together now, in front of All Might and Aizawa, but explaining what had gone on during the month they had been missing? The things that had happened to Katsuki, that he had accepted just to keep Izuku safe? He never wanted to talk about it ever again. "We know. For now we just need to know what happened to the people who were holding you captive, in case they come back." Aizawa assured. "Dead." Katsuki bit out. "Don't have to worry about him. He's dead." Izuku breathed out, nodding and closing his eyes. He already knew, logically, that the surgeon was gone, that Katsuki had somehow gotten rid of him, but there was something more comforting about hearing him say it out loud, a verbal confirmation that Katsuki would never be hurt by that psychopathic, twisted man ever again. His Kaken was safe. "Where were you kept?" Aizawa asked. Izuku shuffled closer to Katsuki on the bed, and the blonde shrugged. "Kinda unconscious during the grand reveal, I don't know." "It was, I don't know, some sort of facility? Only a few streets over by that garden store with the yellow decorations out front." Izuku mumbled. All Might breathed out, sorrow on his face. "You were so close this whole time, and we didn't find you. Young Midoriya, Bakugo, I can only offer my deepest apologies for failing you in such a major way. We should have been there to prevent this from ever happening. It's not your fault." Izuku's head snapped up. "None of this was any of your faults. And it wasn't your effing fault either, dipshit. Don't give me that look." Katsuki added, glaring when Izuku turned to him indignantly. Their teachers looked at the two of them with odd expressions, but Izuku understood that. Before they had been taken, he and Katsuki had never been like this with each other, and not knowing what had gone down in the past month meant this sort of protectiveness towards each other was probably a bit out of the blue. "What's gonna happen now?" Katsuki turned to them after a few moments of silence, ignoring the way Aizawa's gaze lingered on their intertwined hands resting on the bed. "Well, you are still in recovery. We will need to go over your injuries in more detail later, as well as talk about the facility you were held in. Both of your parents have been contacted that you have been found, and they as well as your classmates will want to visit you soon, I'm sure. But for now you both need to rest, and have something to eat and drink. Katsuki especially, we need to talk about the status of your quirk, and your bandages will need to be changed soon." Izuku tensed up as All Might stood up, signifying they were about to leave. "I'm not going back to the other room," he warned. They paused and Katsuki scoffed. "Obviously, Samas. You think I'm letting you out my effing sight?" He turned to Aizawa. "He's staying here, I don't give a shit what you all say." Aizawa looked at the two of them for a moment, before sighing. I guessed you might say that, but you have to stay in that bed, you're not healed yet. I'll get another bed wheeled in for Midoriya. Despite the reassurances, Izuku didn't really relax until it was only him and Katsuki in the room. They were silent for a while. A month, he eventually uttered, Katsuki turning to him questioningly. We were there for a month before I managed to get out. You had to rescue yourself before I found a way to help you. Again, to his frustration, Izuku found tears threatening to fall down his face. I'm sorry, I don't think I was as useful as you thought I would be. Your effing dumbass is what you are. Katsuki refuted. I passed out UF-. You're the reason I'm alive, so I say we're even. I carried you to you. How does that equate to a month of repeated torture in protection of me? Katsuki shrugged. I mean, I told you to kill yourself. Doesn't that balance it out a bit? Izuku stared at him, and Katsuki refused to back down. You can be a real a-hole sometimes, Kaken. And despite everything, Katsuki had the gall to let out a broken laugh, hoarse from his already sore throat being used too much. Yeah, but you already forgave me, so no take-backs. Izuku couldn't help it. He let out a small giggle, leaning forward to rest his forehead on Katsuki's shoulder. His other hand slowly came up, tracing the words carved into his friend's chest. Katsuki let him. Kaken, death. I'd do it again. Izuku made a questioning hum, and Katsuki cleared his throat. Getting taken. I'd do it again. It was worth it. Although I will say it was a bit pathetic that it took torture to clear the air between us. Izuku snorted. It was fun, almost, to joke about it like this. To pretend that what had happened to them didn't affect them, that it was all just fun and games. The aftermath of this would stay with them for who knew how long, and having to deal with everybody else would probably take everything they had. So for the moment, they just allowed themselves to consider it nothing important. To delude themselves that it was okay. Just for a few minutes. And whose fault is that? Kaken, death. Touché, nerd.